So I'm just going to make a property-based argument against abortion. And this is probably going to be something that you've never thought of before and haven't heard of before, so bear with me, okay? We're going to talk about some property things as applied to real property and then apply them to abortion. So the first thing I want to talk about is something called trespass by necessity. This case in America became very famous. It's called Vincent v. Lake Erie, and this was ruled on by the Minnesota Supreme Court way back in 1910. So what happened in Vincent v. Lake Erie essentially is one shipping company owned a dock, in Minnesota, and another boat came in during a big storm and docked on their, attached or anchored their boat to their dock. Okay, so the whole issue was, though, that in doing that, they actually kind of roughed up this person's dock. Like their boat kind of banged into it or something, and so they caused damage to the person's dock by, hooking up their ship there. So the person who owned the dock sued, saying, "I want damages for the damage that you did to my boat." Or excuse me, to my dock. If I could actually speak this well, it would make more sense, right? Let me start over. Okay, there's a big storm. Guy in a boat is like, oh my gosh, I need to dock somewhere. He sees a dock, he hooks his boat up to that. That dock is owned by someone else who gets upset because in the docking process, damage is done to the dock. Okay, that's better. Whew, got that out in one go. Okay, now, it's a long case. It's written in like Old English because it was written in 1910. But first of all, the main holding that you learn in law school is that if you trespass on someone's land and you damage their property, you have to pay those damages. And that's oftentimes what people focus on in terms of this case. But there's another holding in this case that I think is really interesting, which is that in the event of necessity, if someone trespasses on your land and expelling them from your land at that time will cause that person to die, right? Like in this instance, the storm was so bad that if the person who owned the dock had forced the boat owner to go back out into the lake or whatever, that it probably would have killed him. Like the storm was that bad. So part of what the court said was, listen, we understand that they were trespassing, but you can't kick them off your land if kicking them off your land is going to kill them. You have to wait for the storm to pass, and then you can tell them to go. And they'll be liable for whatever damages they did during their trespass. Okay? So that's sort of the basics of trespass by necessity. It's sort of this idea like, yeah, you're trespassing, but we understand that why you're doing it. You're trespassing because to not do so will mean that you're going to die. And in that instance, they're allowed to trespass on your land as long as the threat to their life persists. Okay, so that's kind of that doctrine. And it sort of makes sense, right? We also have rules as well where you can't use unnecessary force against a trespasser. Like you can't just have a bear trap in your yard in case someone walks through. They have to kind of be threatening you in some way for you to use lethal force. Now, if they break into your house in the middle of the night, then that's kind of a different situation. But you can't have like booby traps laid for people just because they're coming on your property. It's like you have to have equal force to what your threat is. So if someone's just trespassing, you can't kill them for just trespassing. They have, it has to be more than that. That's kind of the basics there. So let's talk about property of body for a second, okay? So the woman owns her body, right? And that means she owns her uterus, and she has the right to control and exclude from that. That's part of why rape is a crime, right? You have the right to exclude from your body. But here's some things about property law. You can't, okay, before we even get into the trespass by necessity, let's talk about a case like not rape or incest, but just, maybe you had a one-night stand and you get pregnant after that, okay? that's a case of voluntary intercourse. And there's a doctrine in torts that basically says that you're responsible for the probable consequences of your behavior. And let me give you an example of that. So I'm sitting in this chair right now, but let's say before I sat in it, Edgar was like, oh, let me get this chair for you. And right before I sat down, he pulled it out from under me, and I fell down, and I like hurt myself or whatever. So Edgar could say like, oh, well, but I didn't push her, I didn't knock her down. But legally speaking, he would be responsible for my injuries because he knew that by pulling the chair out from under me that I was going to fall. Okay? So you're responsible for the probable consequences of your actions. Now, maybe Edgar will disagree with me, but one of the probable consequences of having intercourse, especially if you're not using protection, is pregnancy. So in my opinion, in terms of a trespass, in instances of like having voluntary intercourse, the baby is not even a trespasser, just to make that clear. The baby was invited there voluntarily because it's the probable consequence of your actions of having sex. And even if you are using protection, condoms break, birth control doesn't always work, pregnancy is still always a possible result and kind of a probable result of having intercourse. So the only way to really make sure is to not have sex. And if you're, that's kind of a thing. So in my opinion, it's not even a trespass at that point. To expel a baby in that instance would just be outright, that would basically be like killing someone who you invited into your house. Property-wise. But the reason why I spent that whole time talking about trespass by necessity is because I do want to talk about instances of rape or incest. Because that is a little different. You didn't invite that into your body, right? In fact, you wanted to exclude that from your body. And because of, maybe you should have had a gun. But in any event, but because you weren't able to successfully exclude, you became pregnant. And the same thing with incest, because in my opinion, that really is like an involuntary situation. But even in that instance, what you have is a trespass by necessity, at least until the baby is viable. So, in that instance, okay, you have a baby who is now in your womb. You didn't want it there. You didn't have a say in that. It might have some physical impacts on your body, which is your property. But to expel the baby prior to its viability outside of the womb would be to basically, violate this whole doctrine under trespass by necessity, wherein the damages that are being caused to your property should not trump a human life. And you can't expel someone from your property just because they're a trespasser. So, now maybe there could be some legal situation where, to the extent that it was caused by rape or incest, there could be some damages paid to the woman, not necessarily by the baby, because it's really not the baby's fault that they're there either, but maybe by the rapist or the whatever family member committed the incest. They could pay, monetary damages for the, however they would want to monetize the harm to the woman's body for having to carry a baby at least up until viability, or at least up until the baby could be delivered and exist outside of the womb. Because that is kind of the doctrine. It's like if there's damages done as the result of the trespass, then those damages can be compensated for. And I do think that a victim of a rape who becomes pregnant should have some compensation for the fact that they're carrying a baby that was the result of a violation of their property of body. But this is kind of a separate thing, but the crimes of your father should not mean that you get the death penalty. So, maybe your father was a rapist, but that doesn't mean that you don't deserve to live. Maybe you're a baby that's in that womb as the result of a violation of someone's property rights, which is what a trespass is. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a right to your life. And damage to property is not, should not be prioritized over the value of human life, ever, in my opinion. And I think that given that you own your body, it makes sense to apply these property law doctrines to it. You know, it's like if I have a trespasser in my property of body, when am I allowed to expel them and in what conditions? And the truth is, it's like practically in any condition as long as they could survive. So it could be a situation where, I mean, babies are viable at like 22 weeks now. And it could be a situation where instead of getting an abortion, what you do is you carry it for that 22 weeks. And then once they're at a place where they can be viable outside of the womb, you have a C-section or an early delivery or something. And then you go through the adoption process. But it should never, you should never end a human life because of damage to your property. And that's in effect what's happening in an abortion.